I have been asked a number of times about the name Thriving Branch. What exactly does it mean, anyway? And while I have explained it before, it occurs to me that I've not really shared an actual study on it in quite a while. So in light of that, what I want to share with you today is not merely an explanation of the name Thriving Branch. That wouldn't really constitute a Bible study by itself. But the words of Jesus, where the name Thriving Branch comes from, and the amazing truth contained in his words. And as we look at this today, we're going to see some aspects of our identity in Christ that will have a profound effect, even in our daily life. And that's the purpose of this study today. Not to explain a name so much as to see an aspect of our identity in Christ that maybe you have never seen before, or you need to be reminded of. And that's really the purpose of all of our studies. To see our identity in Christ, to see another aspect of what he has done, something that we can take with us, even in our daily life. And even the name Thriving Branch itself can be a pointer and a reminder to our identity in Christ. Welcome to Thriving Branch. I'm Jim. Today we are looking at the name Thriving Branch, but not so much the name, but the words of Jesus from where the name comes from. He said some amazing things in John chapter 15, having to do with vines and branches, and the way that the branches can actually thrive. And we're going to look at that as we begin today. Let's read these words that Jesus spoke, and we'll see some amazing things about him and about our identity in him, and how to be successful in him, how to thrive in him. John chapter 15, verses 1 through 5 is what we're going to be reading. And I'd like us to read this together. John chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. Ready? 1, 2, read. I am the true vine, and my Father is the farmer. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now you are clean through the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can you, except you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He that stays in me, and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. Now, right in verse 1, we see Jesus making a very important statement. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the farmer. Now, some translations say gardener instead of farmer. And Old English translations use the word husbandman. But the point isn't really the word that's used. The point is being that the Father owns and manages the entire tree. And the first half of Jesus' statement here is very interesting. He says that he is the true vine, which tells us that there also are false vines. What is a vine exactly? Well, Jesus wasn't talking about the social media platform here. He was talking about plants, specifically fruit vines. And a vine in this respect is the part of the plant that carries nutrients to the various branches, which in turn sprout leaves and fruit. A branch that is not connected to the vine will wither and die. in the same manner as a severed limb. If your arm gets separated from your body, what happens to the arm? Well, it'll die if it's not reattached in a very short amount of time. Likewise, a branch that is severed from the vine will wither and die. A branch receives its nourishment from the vine in order to continue to live and bear its fruit. And there are many vines that people try to draw nourishment from. It could be religion. They have many religious methods, many traditions. Even the strength in the intellect of man. People try to draw strength from themselves, all in an effort to grow and produce fruit. But Jesus says here that he is the true vine, the definite article, the true vine. And in verse 2, Jesus continues by saying that every branch in him that does not bear fruit, he takes away. The translation here says takes away, which is extremely inaccurate and unfortunate, and has led to a lot of confusion and fear and wrong ideas regarding this. But the actual Greek word here that is translated as takes away is in fact airo, which means to lift up. And in this context specifically, to lift off of the ground. Anyone who has ever worked with fruit-bearing vines knows that a vine on the ground in the dust can't really bear its fruit. And from a spiritual, allegorical standpoint, the ground is where the serpent, Satan, slithers around. And the dust and the ash is what people would put on their heads when they were mourning, in turmoil and distress. Any of you who are familiar with the writings of the Old Covenant know that they would always put dust and ash on their head when they're mourning, when they're sad, when they're in turmoil, when they're in distress. When Adam and Eve fell in the Garden of Eden, God cursed the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, and said that he would eat dust. And again, from a spiritual, from an allegorical standpoint, when a person is in deep distress and turmoil and loaded down with cares and worries, well, that's food for the devil. And here in our verses in John chapter 15, Jesus said, if there is any branch in me that isn't bearing fruit, my Father, the gardener, the farmer, will lift it off the ground. In other words, he'll take you out of the dust. You see, Jesus isn't making a threat here. I've heard some leaders in churches say that this verse means if your life isn't producing fruit, God will flat out kill you. And they say that's what takes away means here. But now we understand that's not true at all. Jesus isn't making a threat. He isn't saying that if your life isn't producing enough fruit, God's going to kill you. He's in fact giving you a wonderful promise, an assurance of his care for you. If your life doesn't seem to be bearing fruit, God's not going to flatten you. He's going to lift you off of the ground. And how exactly does he do that? How does he lift a person out of the dust? Well, again, anyone who has ever tended fruit vines know that if you find a branch on the ground, you lift it up and place it on a trellis, which is typically a wooden cross-shaped figure designed to support the branch, keep it off the ground so that it can flourish. And yes, it is cross-shaped, which I also think is very telling of the purpose of our study today as well. It's no accident that these images were used by Jesus. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he knew exactly what he was referencing and painting a picture of. The way in which God lifts a person out of their cares and worries, the turmoil and the mourning of life, is not with empty platitudes or further burdens of legalism or telling them to just suck it up, but by carrying them himself, by allowing them to cast all of their cares upon him, because he cares for you. That's 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. Another thing that we see here, right in verse 2 of John chapter 15, is that every branch that bears fruit, he purges it. And this is another very misleading word. Again, it's caused a lot of confusion and fear over the years. However, the Greek word translated here as purges actually means to clean, to remove the filth, to remove the dust, to remove anything that would hinder the branch or keep its beauty from being clearly seen. And as we see from the end of the verse, this cleaning causes it to bear more fruit. So again, it's not a threat. It's not saying that if you are not producing enough fruit, that God will purge you, which they say generally means to beat or to consume or whatever some religious leaders came up with. But it actually means to clean, to remove filth, to remove the dust, to remove anything that would hinder you and cause you to bear even more fruit. So how does he accomplish this cleaning? Because there have been leaders who also say that this purging means God will punish you, beat you, whip you until you produce more fruit. But again, this is not true at all. Look at verse 3, and verse 3 will prove to you that this isn't a threat. Now you are clean through the word which I've spoken to you. And we have in the past studied the details of how his words clean us when we studied the discipline of God. If you haven't yet viewed that study, I would encourage you to do so. And spoiler alert, it's nothing to be afraid of. The short answer for the purposes of this study today, though, is his words will always focus us and focus our attention back on himself, back on his love and his finished work. By doing that, we can stop struggling, we can stop worrying, we can stop striving, and we can start thriving. And then we have verse 4. His encouragement continues. Jesus says, "Abide in me, and I in you." And this doesn't seem like much at first, but this is a huge statement that has the power to change your perspective. Jesus here is saying, live in me, and I live in you. Spend some time meditating on this statement that Jesus is saying here. Live in me, and I live in you. This will explode your reality, your perception of your identity in Christ. To abide means to live in. And as you would live inside of a house, a permanent dwelling. And here we see Jesus saying that as we live in him, he also lives in us. We are in union. We are one with each other. And as we also see, the reason why he wants this to be, it's for our benefit. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself except it abides in the vine, neither can you except you abide in me. Jesus wants us to live in him, to abide in his shelter, to be inside of his protection, inside of his covering. and inside of his care. It may be torrential rain outside. It may be lightning and hail on the outside. But as long as you are safely in the house, you can be at peace. You can be unharmed. And that's one of the pictures here. As you are abiding in Christ, living in him, living with his identity, the storms of life truly can't harm you. You are safe in the house. There are other scriptures that mention this as well. The entire chapter of Psalms 91, which we've studied before, and its promises for protection. But I want you to see this picture today, because it is a wonderful example of the love and the care that God has for you. Additionally, Jesus mentions that abiding in him is the only way for us to bear any fruit. And this is another important truth, because as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people trying to produce fruit by their own efforts, by their own strength, by their own intellect, by their traditions, by their religion. But do you understand the difference? On the one hand, we have people trying to produce fruit. But you notice here, Jesus never uses the word produce. He says, you will bear fruit. Bearing fruit is different than producing fruit. Many people struggle to try and produce fruit of themselves, but bearing fruit is something you do effortlessly, naturally. It's simply a reality because you are a branch connected to the vine, receiving the nourishment, receiving the nutrients, and you will naturally bear fruit because you're connected to the true vine. We are not called to produce fruit. This is a lesson from history that a lot of people still need to learn. So many people, I've watched it happen over the years. So many people burn themselves out and get nowhere because they're trying to produce something for God instead of letting him produce for them and inside of them while they simply rest and abide in him. The children of Israel pridefully declared in Exodus chapter 19, verse 8, that all that God has said they will produce within themselves. They said this. Kol asher daber Adonai na'aseh. All that God has said, we will produce. And we know what that led to. Cain also tried to offer God the produce of the land, the works of his hands, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. And Cain's offering was rejected by God, while Abel, on the other hand, brought blood, the firstborn, the best of the flock. Today, what do we have? We have the best of all. We have the blood of the eternal Lamb, which is Jesus Christ, and he does far better. He does far more than simply cover sins for 1 year, like the sacrifices of the Old Covenant. He completely removes sin for all time and gives us absolute rebirth, a new identity in him. He protects, he provides, and he enables us to bear fruit. We don't struggle, we don't sweat, or strive to produce fruit within ourselves, but as any branch, we receive from the vine everything that we need. We allow the vine to nourish us as we rest, and we simply bear fruit. We bear the fruit of the vine. This is why Jesus says in the final verse 5 of our text in John chapter 15 today, that he is the vine, we are the branches. As we live in him and he lives in us, we bear much fruit, because apart from him, we can do nothing. That's very clear. Apart from him, we can do absolutely nothing. Why? Because as mentioned earlier, a severed branch is dead. It has no life apart from its vine. Yet connected to him, we don't merely bear a little fruit, but we bear much fruit. You see? We don't strive, we thrive. And that, my dear friend, is where the name Thriving Branch comes from. You are a branch that is thriving in Jesus Christ. Be blessed.